One of the first series of posts that I did when I started ArchSmarter was this whole Excel for Architects series. And part of it came from this realization that Excel really is an essential design tool. You know, as much as we use Photoshop, as we use BIM, Revit, AutoCAD, all that stuff, we're always using Excel at the same time. And I don't know about you, but you know, I never had any formal training in Excel. I just kind of figured it out all by myself. And, you know, that wasn't really sufficient because I knew there's industries out there, like in the financial industry, for example, where they use, they're using Excel really, really at a high level, and they're doing all sorts of things in terms of, you know, advanced calculations. They're doing, you know, charting, data visualization, all within Excel. And I realized, you know, I only know like this top thin layer of how to use it. You know, essentially, I know like 10%, if that, and that I wanted to go in more to see what else it could do. Again, because I was using it, you know, at least once a day, sometimes more than that, you know, and certainly I was using it every week. And again, I just knew very, very little. And that led me into this Excel for Architects, digging into some of the features. And I realized, you know, Excel is a lot more than just digital graph paper. It's more than just a calculator. So in this session today, what I want to do is show you some of the more advanced features. We're going to go over things like pivot tables. I had no idea what a pivot table was, and then I saw it and was like, whoa, that's actually really cool and really useful. We're going to look at using named ranges. We're going to look at how you can start to separate the data in your spreadsheet from the actual output from the presentation. We'll look at formulas in depth, and then we're also going to get into some graphic tips that you can use to make your spreadsheets look a lot better. So it's a little bit of everything into this kind of 1 hour format. And this may be the first presentation you've ever seen that is done 100% in Excel. So even my slides are all done in Excel. So I figured we're going to go all in on this. Okay, so let's go to our agenda. And here's the topics that we're going to look at today. So to start with, let's start at the very basics, and we'll talk about the parts of an Excel file. And essentially in Excel, at least in kind of Excel speak, you have the workbook, which is the Excel file itself, and then you have the worksheets. So for example, in any single Excel file, in any Excel workbook, you can have multiple sheets. So in this case, I have a title sheet, I have a data sheet, and then I have a presentation sheet. And they're all part of that one file. Now, it's possible within Excel to link between different worksheets from one worksheet to the other, and you can also link from one workbook to another. So let me switch my file, and this is, again, where it starts to get a little bit interesting. Now, say, for example, that you have a area spreadsheet, and you know you're working in, say you're working in a Revit model, and then you're exporting your areas from Revit into your spreadsheet. So I have a worksheet here that's called area, and it's very simple. I have 10 rooms, 10 room names, and then I have my measured area. Now, I also have another worksheet here called my program area. So this comes from my program spreadsheet, and it lists all of my various program areas here. Now, what I've done in the past, and I'm sure you've done too, is you just kind of copy this, and then I paste it into my other spreadsheet, and then I make it look nice, and that's it. Now, one thing I want to encourage you to think about is how you can start to separate the actual data from the way that you're presenting the data. And one good way you can do that is by creating links between the data itself and then link it into another worksheet. For example, again, if I have this area worksheet and I'm getting my areas from my Revit model, you know, that's going to change over time. So if I actually make a spreadsheet that then shows all of those areas, every time I update my Revit model and get new areas, I'm going to have to recreate that spreadsheet. Now, wouldn't it be better if instead I could just link my areas into my final spreadsheet, and then that's it. Every time I need to update the data, I just update it, paste it into my area worksheet here, and then my final one is all presented and fine, and so I don't have to recreate the formatting over and over and over. Unfortunately, that's something that Excel makes really easy. So I'm going to just make a new worksheet here, and then all I need to do, if I'm going to link if I want to link a cell from one worksheet to the other, is I just type equal sign, and then I click on that worksheet that I want, and then I select the cell that I want, and then I hit return. And so in this case, if you look up, if you can see this, let me zoom in a little bit, you'll see this, that it's in the actual kind of cell area is showing me equals area, and then I have an exclamation point A2. So this is a link to the cell in the area worksheet, cell number A2. So if I were to drag this down like I can do in Excel, that's going to adjust that. So now I'm creating links to cell A3, A4, A5, A6, A7, A8, so on and so forth. And then I can also select these cells and I can drag them over. And you'll see that I'm actually I'm creating links, extending that link to the other parts of that worksheet as well. So in this case, I have let me just add some headers, my room number, room name, and then let's say this is area. So what I want to do now is I'm going to create a spreadsheet that combines our area from the model and then also our program area, so we can do a calculation and see where we're missing area. So in this case, now what I want to do is I want to bring in my program area. Again, that's kept in a separate worksheet. And all I have to do is type the equal sign. I select that worksheet, and then I select the cell that I want to link in. And I hit return. And again, one thing that makes this possible is that my area in my program area worksheets are synchronized in the sense that room 1 is followed by room 2, room 3, room 4. That way, there's a relationship across that by the room number. So now if I drag down my program area field, so now I'm bringing in my program areas linked in from my program area worksheet. And let's just call this program area. Okay. And if I want to do just a real quick calculation and I want to subtract my area from the program area to see where my differences are, I just type the equal sign to indicate that this is a formula. I select the first field, then I do minus and the second field, and then I hit return. So my area of 100 minus my program area of 100 obviously is 0. And I can drag this down again and it will calculate that, do that same operation, do that same calculation all the way down. So I can see here that where I have my differences. Now what's nice about this is if I go into the area spreadsheet, again because I'm linking the cells, if I make some changes here, so let's say this is not room 1 but it's office, and we'll call this room office, and then we'll say this is restroom, we'll call this classroom, and oops, my spelling is a little bit off. Here we go. Closet, and so forth. Now when I go back to my spreadsheet, oops, where? Here we go. You'll see that it's actually brought those links across. So I can then edit my values. It's kind of like if you think about XREFs in AutoCAD, for instance, or linked files in Revit. I can link my data from one cell to the next. And that way I maintain those relationships. I can do whatever I want to do in here, and I will still always have this presented and looking the way that I want. And as this data changes, or as this data changes, it's always going to be updated. Now I can create links also across files. So I could link data from another spreadsheet that's in a totally different file, and I do it basically the same way. So I have a bunch of spreadsheets open here, so I'm just going to select a cell. I'm going to do my equal sign. I'm going to switch over to one of my other spreadsheets, and then I hit return, and you'll see when I select the cell, it's telling me, again, the file name now, and then the worksheet, and then the actual cell that I'm creating. So that's a good way if you have linked files that you can create relationships across them. Now, one thing to note when you're linking data across files is that you want to be conscious of where those files are saved. So just like in Revit, just like in AutoCAD, it's easy for those links to break. So if a file moves, goes somewhere else, or you forget where it is, like you may lose the links. So I would only link data across files if that relationship of the one workbook to the other is pretty stable. Like if they're in the same folder and they're always going to go together. Otherwise, you can bring the data into a new worksheet, copy it there, and then do your linking. But you do have a lot of flexibility, and again, it's very easy. All you have to do is the equal sign, select the cell you want, and then you're good to go. So this is something that I will come back to again and again. And again, it's this idea of separating your data from the way that that data is going to be presented. And we'll look at that more specifically when we talk about creating tables in Excel, which is a really great feature. And that's one thing, when you do that, you're thinking of the data itself, and then you're thinking separately of how that's going to be presented. So this was a real simple example. Let's go to something that's a little bit more interesting. And what I'm going to do is I'm showing here, this is kind of a standard programming spreadsheet. So we have a description of spaces. Let me just grab a drink of water. Oh, sorry, Bob, you're saying you have no sound. Does everybody else have sound? Can you hear okay? Just give me a yes or no in your box there. Yes, okay. All right, sorry, Bob, I'm not sure. It looks like everybody's good. Check your headphones on your end. So again, this is a pretty standard programming spreadsheet. Our list of spaces, we have a list of requirements, unit sizes, so on and so forth. And then again, this is how I've always done, at least until recently, I would always do a program like this. And then I would format it and I would group them by type and go with it that way. Now, again, if we start to think about separating our data, whereas in our original example, we have our fields here, description, unit size, dimensions, and so forth. And then we were creating headers, so our head count space, enclosed conference spaces, support, so on and so forth. What if instead that we separate that out and we make a column specifically for category? So we have the name of the space, then we're showing its category, and then we get into its unit size, its minimum size, and so on and so forth. And so again, we're talking about it, looking at the data itself, not necessarily the way that we're going to separate it out. So if we start with this, one nice feature that you can use in Excel is you can use the table feature. And so all I'm doing is I'm just selecting a cell here, and then I go to the Insert ribbon. Actually, sorry, Adriano, yeah, I would just follow along. If you have Excel open, you're certainly welcome to try it out as we go through it. And you don't need the example files. I think it's better to try this out on your own files so that you can get a good feel for how it actually works. But if you just want to watch along or kind of play with this stuff as you go in Excel, you're also, again, I'll send you the video of the training so you can try it out, and rewind and so forth as you need to. So I've selected a cell, and then I'm going to go to the Insert ribbon, and then I click on Table. And what this is going to do is it's going to define my data as an Excel table. And this gets pretty interesting because what I can do is I can filter all of my data a lot more easily. So you look at, just by turning it into a table, now I can use these drop downs for each of these, and I can filter this data automatically. So Excel is considering this as an object, and I can do a lot of stuff with it because of that. It's also giving me shading the alternate rows. And again, I can go through all of these. So category, if I want to sort, I can just select which category specifically I want to see, and the spreadsheet is going to filter itself automatically. I don't have to go up to and use data filter. Excel will do that directly in the spreadsheet. Let me go back to select all. And if I click on my table again, you'll see that there's, over on the right-hand side, there is a design ribbon. So it's a context ribbon that pops up, and I have a lot of options here. So I can name this table, and we'll talking about naming things in a little bit. So I can name it, but I can also go through and I can choose whether or not I want to show the header row, if I want banded rows or not, if I want banded columns. So I have a lot of options just in terms of displaying this, but then there's also a lot of functional options as well. Do I want filter buttons or not? I can export directly from this. I have a lot of, again, because it's considered a table and not just a bunch of cells, Excel gives you a little bit more power to use that. Now I can, again, check, if I want to make this orange, great, I can do that, yellow, whatever I want. I have a lot of options. What gets a little bit more interesting, though, is, again, if I select, I'm inside of my table, I can insert a slicer. So I'm going to click on that. And one thing when I got started with Excel, one thing I realized is that they use a lot of weird names for things that I wouldn't call it that way. So for example, we'll talk about pivot tables. When I hear the word pivot table, maybe it's because I'm an architect, I think of, something that pivots or turns. Turns out, pivot tables are totally different. They have nothing to do with turning or pivoting, at least as far as I'm concerned. Same thing goes with slicers. Slicer is kind of a weird name. Essentially what it lets you do is it lets you filter your data on the fly. So it's really, really useful. So I can select, grab this slicer here. So I can select how I want to slice the data and say I want to slice it by category. I'm going to click OK. And then basically what it does is it inserts this little like gizmo in my Excel file. So now I can sort my data automatically just by collecting or clicking on any of these items. Or I could select a whole bunch of them and it will group them together. So it makes your spreadsheet a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more user-friendly in the sense that you don't have to manually do the sorting. You can do that. And we'll come back to slicers. Yeah, it does sort of look a bit like a grasshopper component. And you'll see, too, a lot of this stuff when we get into pivot tables, too, it's not like these things aren't really embedding themselves in the spreadsheet. They kind of float on top of it, which makes it, it's a little bit interesting. But we'll talk about slicers once we get into pivot tables. But again, I think that the takeaway here is that you can use this table object and format your data, put your data essentially into the table object, and it gives you a lot more features to deal with, navigate, and use the data. Okay. So let me switch back here into my Excel presentation file. And you'll see actually I've built this presentation file here. This is set up as a slicer. So I have the presentation part of this, is only for presentation. All my individual topics that I want to talk about are set up as a table in Excel. And then, again, it's totally separate from the actual presentation of that. So we talked about the table format, and let me go over here for a sec. And let's talk about named ranges. So named ranges are, Ramel asks a question about established links to other workbooks and sheet. So yes, they do remain intact, as you close the file and then open again, as long as you maintain the relationship of one workbook to the other workbook, that link will be maintained. If you start moving the files around relative to each other, then you're going to lose that link to them. So it can be a little bit tenuous. It's something to play with again, and I think a lot of times you want to make sure if you're going to link between files, be very careful, simply because you can lose that link, and that can be problematic. Okay. Oops, sorry. Hold on. I wanted to see this, and let me go here. Okay, so we're talking about named ranges, and named ranges are really good because you can actually name things like a variable inside of your Excel file, and it's particularly useful if you're using formulas, for example. So if you're going to calculate all of your area, for your first floor or your second floor or within a particular department, you can create a named range specifically for those cells. And to create a named range, you just go up to Formulas, and then you use the Name Manager. And I click this, and you can see that just by doing some stuff, for example, I've already created some named ranges. Let me delete this one here. And you'll see that I have a slicer that has a name. Also, my table has a name. So as I'm creating these various objects, they are getting names inside of Excel. Now, what I can also do is I can create constant values inside of my Excel file. So for example, I'm going to make a constant value for converting inches to millimeters. So if I have to make a spreadsheet that is going to do a lot of calculations and unit translations, I can set that value, and then I can always refer to it by name. So if I do inches to millimeters, and I'm going to set that value equal to 25.4. So now I have that value. Anytime I want to refer to it, I can just call it out by name. So for example, if I have say, 10 inches times inches to, let me set this up as a formula. So I want to type equal inches to, you'll see that it actually comes up and I can select it directly. Let me do this again. Equals, okay, so 10 times my constant value, inches to millimeters. And then it's going to do that calculation. So you can, if you have some constant values that you use, you can set up a named range for that. You can also, if that value ever changes, so, for example, if the value of 24.5 miraculously changes to 35, I hit close, and then it's going to update that value. Again, my calculation is not specifically set to 25.4. It's set to the value of inches to millimeters. There's a couple questions. The number of items changes for the extra row. So if you have a formatted table, no, it's actually going to expand as it goes. And that's what's actually really nice about the tables, is that tables know how big they are. So as you're adding rows, it is adjusting wherever that table is used automatically. For example, I had to add into right before the presentation, I added a couple of new items that I was going to put into the presentation. So I just added them in at the bottom, and then when I went into the presentation, it automatically added them, even specifically to my slicer here. So that's also another great thing about tables, is that they expand and contract for you. So that actually works out really nicely. Okay, so named ranges can also, like I said, they can apply to a series of cells, or they can apply to a particular value. And that's, again, it gets actually really, let me see, let's call this one range. And then here's my range right here. So I've defined that range. So they are useful to use in that regard, because then you're not worried about things shifting around. You're saying, here, I've defined this range. If this is first floor, so let's call first floor area. And let me just set this up: 100, 110, 120, 5. And then I'm going to go, and sometimes too you can right-click, and I can just click on Define Name, and I'm going to call that first floor area. And you'll see it's automatically defining exactly where that area is. So I can then do a formula, and we'll talk about formulas shortly. I'm going to sum, and let's see if I can just do that directly. And it doesn't like it. Oops, here we go. First floor area. And I'll close that formula. So because I've defined this area here as a range, I can then use that rather than specifying all of these numbers. I can instead specify my named range. So I can just do a summation of the first floor area. So if I add a couple of cells, say 150 and 200, I can then go and I can update my named range here. And let's change this, and let's add, update it to include the additional cells. I hit close. And now let me try that one more time. I'm doing this live, so you get all sorts of funny stuff happening. Sorry, I need to edit that. And I'm going to set that to pick up row 12, and that should be good. Yep. So you'll see that it actually updated this cell right here because I changed the value, I changed the range of my first floor area. So again, named ranges are great in that regard, because then instead of managing like which cell am I dealing with, and if you're anything like me, when you're defining cells, a range of cells in Excel, you have cell column E, cell 6, or row 6 through 8, and then I'd rather give that thing a name than have to figure out what cells I'm actually looking at. Just all those letters and numbers, I get a little bit confused. Again, maybe it's because I'm an architect. I'd rather give it a name. So named ranges and using the name manager is one good way to simplify that. And also, too, once you get into really complex or bigger spreadsheets, we go back to our programming spreadsheet example where you have lots of columns and you're doing different formatting based on the data. Named ranges give a little bit of sanity to it, and it makes it easier for that Excel file to change and adjust, so you're not worrying about exactly which row which column. You can just deal with that named range. A couple things, too. Let's talk about cell formatting. And you just clear this out, a little test area here. And cell formatting, you can do some really interesting things here. For example, one of the issues if you're doing an area spreadsheet is that you want to calculate like your areas here. 120, I'm just going to put some numbers down. And say these are, my room areas, and I want to get my total. So I'm going to use the sum. There we go. So I do the summation here. Now, sometimes when you're getting area, either you're getting it from Revit or you're getting it from AutoCAD. Kelsey, if you add cells in the middle of a range, yeah, the range is going to adjust itself to accommodate that. So you're saying if I added a row, typically, I'll have to test it, but I'm pretty sure that it's smart enough to know that rows have been added, and then it will adjust itself. I'll test that. Let me test that in 1 second. Let me just go back to our cell formatting. So you're getting cells back from, or you're getting data from AutoCAD, you're getting it from Revit, you're getting it from wherever. A lot of times you're getting the area and it's coming out as you're getting, like, say, a prefix on the end that has your square feet. And this is kind of a problem if you're trying to do a calculation, right? So Excel, if it's just a number, it's going to consider it to be a number, and it can add numbers to numbers. Once you add, say, square foot, square meters, whatever, and once you add an element of text to that, then you start to run into problems because now it's not a number. Excel considers it a piece of text, and obviously it can't add a piece of text. So you can do some custom number formats. Let me go back to this. And that's where it gets a little bit fun. So I'm going to go, I'm going to actually select all these cells. I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to go to Format Cells. And then I'm going to go down here to the bottom to Custom. So I can format those cells to any general number. So any general data type. So I can say, it's a text, it's a number, it's currency, date, whatever. You don't see an option here, obviously, for square meters or square feet, but we can add that in. So what I'm going to do is in the sample, I'm going to make my own. And I'm going to change this, and instead of 0, I'm going to type SF. Click OK. Oops, sorry. It's giving me, it didn't like that. So it needs the 0, so let's add that 0, and then we'll do SF. And it didn't like that either. So here, let's try this one more time. I'm going to go to 0. We'll keep it simple. And then in quotes, I'm going to type SF. So you can see at the top here, it's actually adding, yes, thanks, Michael, in quotes. So I'm adding the SF as a suffix to my data. So I'm going to click OK. And you'll see that now it's formatting all of that data with an SF suffix. So it's not coming out of the, it's not changing the number itself. It's still a number. Excel still considers it to be a number, but it's just adding that on. So I can still add these numbers up in the end. Again, so if you need to do calculations, but you actually need to show particular values or unit designations, doing a custom data type is one really good way to do that. You can also get, you can get pretty fancy with this. So if I wanted to do commas in there to show thousands, you can add that. So if I can use number, comma, number, let's try this. Number, and let's hit OK. And so if I change this to 20, nope, there we go. So it's automatically going to add commas to break it up and make it a little bit more legible. Again, even though it's adding a comma, which is an element of punctuation, Excel still considers this to be a number, and it can still sum it up at the bottom. So that's definitely something to look into when you're doing your formatting. That's really useful. Now, okay, we're about halfway through. I'm going to have a sip of water. How's everybody doing? So Mario, you're asking, how do you find the format cell? There's a couple ways you can get it. If you right-click, my computer just locked up. Hold on one sec. There we go. Okay. You can right-click in a cell, and then you go to Format Cells. That's an easy way to do it. The other way to do it is if you go to the home ribbon, and where is it? It's somewhere here. Part of my ribbon is blanked out because of the GoToWebinar stuff. Actually, if you go to number, I believe. It's somewhere in here. I'm sorry, I can't find it right. No, not conditional. We'll look at conditional formatting. The way, yeah, I'm sorry, right there. So if you click in the, let me go back, let me close this for you. And so you go to the home ribbon, and then you'll see that there's this number section, and then click this little down arrow here in the corner of the number section, and then you'll get that format cells. Celeste, you're asking about format feet and inches. That's a good question. I haven't found a way to do that, particularly if you're going to do calculations, like if you want to do, you know, add, if you want to add architectural units across. That's a really good question. I'll look and see if there is a way. There may be a way through an add-in because it's a little bit, it's a, you know, it's a base 12 number, not a base 10, but that's a great question. Okay, so let's talk about, since we're talking a little bit about formulas, let's jump into it and look at them a little bit more in depth. And one thing about formulas, you know, there is a lot of formulas that you can use in Excel. If you go into the formulas ribbon at the top here, you know, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of different formulas. They're really easy to use. It's just a question of which ones, you know, do you really use. Like I said at the beginning, excuse me, there's, you know, the financial industry uses Excel a lot. Engineers use Excel a lot. So there's a lot of math functions that are built in, but there's also, you know, trigonometry, there's logical functions. So you can build these extremely complex Excel spreadsheets. And at that point, they're really not so much a spreadsheet, they're kind of a data model. So there's a lot there. What I've done is gone through and pulled out, you know, a bunch that I have found to be really useful. And we'll walk through these. And anytime you want to insert a formula, all you have to do to start it is use the equal sign. And that's going to tell Excel that, hey, this is something different. We're going to do, this isn't, you know, a number. This isn't a, this isn't a number. This isn't just a piece of text. We're going to do some calculations. And Andrew, you're saying you can add square feet by holding down Alt 253 on the number pad. Interesting. Okay, I'll have to check that out. So look, sum is probably the easiest one, and I'm sure, you know, most of you know how to use this. All you're going to do is you're going to type equals, and then you type sum, and then in parentheses you select the number range that you want to add together, or you type in, you know, the named range that you want to use. And then Excel is going to go through and it's just going to add those up one to the next. So in this example, we have a summation of cells A2 to A9. Same thing. In here, I'm selecting individual cells that I want to add up. So again, it can be a range of numbers or it can be individual numbers. And then this last one, I'm adding two numbers that I want to add up. I want to add actually that entire range. So I can select a whole number range and add them all together. I think sum is probably like the workhorse of all the formulas. That's the one that I use probably the most, and I'm sure the same thing for you. Now, a couple things about formulas, and particularly when you're using sum, is that Excel can do what are called, typically it will do relative references to cells. So for example, I'm selecting, you know, this range here. Now, if I were to copy this number, let's copy it over, and you'll see that my number range shifted. Oh, sorry, Nicholas. Let me, that's a good point. So you're saying that it's hard to see the equations. Yeah, because they're kind of small because I'm in a high res. I don't want to switch the res right now, but what I will do is I will make this, this spreadsheet available for download. But that's a good point. I'll have to, again, this is my first time I've actually done the webinar, so I need to make a note to lower my res. Thank you very much. And again, I apologize for that, everyone. So Brian, you're asking, is there a reason to use the equal sign, or to use, is there a reason to use sum versus just adding those numbers up? Not necessarily. I always think of sum as going, you're adding up a range of numbers. So if you wanted to add B2 plus B3, you can just do it, you know, select B2 and B3. Sum will also work in that capacity, but it seems like it's a bit overkill. I use sum typically, rather than typing, in this instance, rather than type plus, A2 plus A3 plus A4, sum works great because I'm doing it across a column of numbers. In this example where I'm just selecting individual cells, I don't, in that case, you can just use the plus sign as a typical, operator. That works well. Again, I think sum is really better for this case. So going back to absolute versus relative, typically in Excel, it's going to refer to any of the number ranges that we're specifying as relative numbers. So that means if I were to paste this number like I did, let me just delete this. If I paste this number over 1, it's going to adjust my cell range relative to the position of that cell. Now, sometimes that works out great, sometimes it doesn't. Now, so for example, in this case, if I want to just calculate that same range of numbers, I can tell, I can specify that these are absolute ranges. And the way that I do that is that I actually use the dollar sign. So let's try that. If I do $A, $2, $B, $9. So I'm saying that these are absolute values. So now when I copy this value and paste it, it knows that it shouldn't adjust itself automatically. It's going to fix those numbers, those cell ranges right there. So where this is useful, for example, if I wanted to multiply, say, this range of numbers by, say, another number. So I would do equals, select this number times this number, and that works out fine. And now I just want to add my dollar signs into it. So now I'm fixing that value. When I drag this down, now I'm multiplying again my relative number, which is B3, against this fixed number, B2. Same thing goes here, B4, B5, and it's adjusting the number without the dollar signs, and it's incrementing it, but it's keeping it fixed on that one number. So that's a good thing to know. I run into that a lot. I know, like, I'll copy and paste and I'll drag it down, and then it's changing all the time. And I'm like, oh, no, I want that one to be fixed. So again, you can always set that to be an absolute reference with your dollar signs. Okay, so let's get back to, we're going to go over some more of these formulas pretty quickly because there's a couple other things I want to get to. So if is another good formula to use. And in this case, what I'm doing is I have just a real simple spreadsheet that has my target area and my actual area. And then I use an if formula. So I'm saying if, and then in parentheses, value A3 is greater than B3, then I want it to output need area. If that case is not true, then I can say the area is okay. So if my target area is greater than my actual area, print need area. If that's false, type area okay. And so that's all that does. It just does a comparison of one value to the next, and then it tells me, it gives me an output. So again, if you're doing something, this gives you a real quick check to say, is my area okay or not? And then I can use that formula to do it for me. Now, building on that is the SUMIF formula. So this one will add numbers based on, so this class is, I'm recording this class, so you will be able to download it, and yeah, hopefully that will make, you'll be able to, take a look at these things individually. And Jerry, you're asking a shortcut to make the range cells. That's a good question. Now, I don't know. I need to follow up on that to see. There has to be. I don't know it off the top of my head, but I'm sure there is, and I'll find out for you. So looking at SUMIF, this allows me to add numbers up if a particular condition is satisfied. So in this case, the first case, I want to add up the numbers if they're greater than 0. So I type equals SUMIF, I specify my range, and then I specify in quotations the value that I'm looking for. So in this case, if this number range, if the value of the number is greater than 0, add them together. So here it's only adding up 100, 201, 102, 104, so forth. I can create another SUMIF that I only want to add up the values that are less than 0. So again, same thing, I use equal SUMIF, and then I specify my number range, which is right here. And then I say if that number value, my criteria, is less than 0. And then it's only going to add up those numbers. And then my third, oops, let me back up. My third example here, I can add a number range, and I can only add up the number of values that are between a specific range. So for example, I only want to add up the numbers that are greater than 100 but less than 200. So I can then say, here's what I want. So a couple questions, export the area information back to Excel. Anthony, that's a different conversation. There's a couple ways that you can do that. You can do that obviously with a custom macro. You can do it with Dynamo. Depending on the type of data that you want to put back in Excel, there's a couple ways you can do it. There's also some tools out there. Actually, I did a post on ArchSmarter, which I can send you a link to, that talks about that, getting data in and out of with Excel. A couple other questions. The criteria will work in the formula. Alexander is asking, how do you know the criteria? The one thing with formulas, and particularly when you're dealing with criteria, is a lot of it's trial and error. The thing that works out best, and I'm just giving kind of an overview, a quick overview of it, but greater than, less than, or if you're looking for a particular value. So you're looking at kind of conditional logic. So is this equal to that? Is this greater than that? Or is this less than that? Can we create an Excel spreadsheet, Beth is asking, with a dynamic link to Revit? There are a couple tools out there, Beth, that will create dynamic-ish. Actually, if you want dynamic, then Dynamo is a great way to do it. Dynamo works great because it will create a dynamic link. And again, I'll send out a link that has a post that talks about that. I have a video, too, on YouTube that goes through how you would create that in Dynamo. And there's also, too, some add-ins that you can buy that will do that for you as well. Yes, so Elrond, you're asking about in the brackets, the range is in there a bunch of times. And that's where this one gets, you can nest formulas inside of formulas. So in this case, you can have a SUMIF, which is this one, and then I do a SUMIFs. So I actually have two SUMIFs going on. So I'm saying, here's my range, and then the criteria range, and then here's the criteria. And then I have a criteria range again, and then I have the criteria. So I'm saying it does get a little bit complicated in this case because I'm applying the range. So I'm summing the numbers over a particular range, and then I'm applying that criteria over over a particular range. So you can kind of disconnect that. So I could say add these numbers. In this case, if I wanted to add these numbers, but then say I had a series of room names or other values that I wanted to check that criteria against, I could build that into this SUMIFs value. So it does get, there's an element of kind of programming logic that comes from Excel, I think, where you have these kind of functions that get a lot, where there's a lot of arguments, and that's one example of that. Okay, so let's go over to count. Count is a great one. There's a bunch of different ways you can count things. So for example, I'm using this first one. Let me zoom in so you can see that. So in this case, I'm just counting cells with numbers. So my formula is just called count, and then here's my number range. So if a cell has a number, it's going to get counted. In this case, I have 8 cells, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Then let's check that out again. Okay, and you can see in here that I have a couple of cells that are filled with letters. So it's not a number, so the count statement isn't going to do that. I can also use count A, and what this is going to do is it's going to count every cell that has a value, whether it's a number or not. In this case, there's 10. So I have some numbers and I have some letters. Count A is going to add those up. And then I can also use this other value called count blank, and that's going to just count blank cells within that particular range. So Sherry's saying that she can't hear me. Can everybody hear me? Everybody okay? Oh, Christina, same thing. Anybody else? Okay. Don't know if the audio drops in and out. Looks like a bunch of you can hear me, so that's good. One thing with the webinar I've found too, a lot of it depends on your bandwidth on your end. Yeah, okay, so you're saying, yeah, it gets messed up every once in a while. Carlos, you can hear me from London, that's great. I'll have to, okay, good. All right, so count is good. Again, if you're going to count, like how many rooms do I have in my, in my programming spreadsheet, you can use this. And again, it's just going to check all the values. Grab a sip of water. Now, COUNTIF is a good one too, because it's only going to count if a particular criteria is met. So in this case, zoom in, it's only going to count the numbers that are greater than 100. So how many numbers are greater than 100? Well, it's telling me that I have 4 numbers. So I have 101, 102, 299, and 200. And so I could also use this if I wanted to, how many bathrooms, how many, mechanical closets, how many classrooms do I have? I can use COUNTIF in this capacity as well. And I can set up greater than and less than values. So in this case, I'm looking at, again, I have a bunch of ranges here where I'm counting this particular range where the value is greater than 100, and then I've added another COUNTIF. Here's my second range, which is the same range, and these values less than 100. So it's counting that out. But imagine if you wanted to, if this is true in this column and this is true in that column, and if this is true in that column, give me the number of counts. And yeah, yes, you're separating the ranges, or actually you're separating pretty much each field inside of your formula with commas. So COUNTIF is good. You'll see like a lot of these functions there's if variations of them. So we did if, we did SUMIF, we did COUNTIF. Another good one is average. This is going to give you the average of a range of numbers. Again, if you wanted to get the average room size, for example. So, okay, Sherry, you're saying, I see the phone-in option didn't work. Okay, I'll check with the go-to folks and see what that's doing. So you're looking, where can you find, is there a cheat sheet listing these formulas? The best place to go, or if you want all of the formulas, if you go in Excel to the formulas ribbon, you'll see this is pretty much every single formula. If you want to see, these are all the statistical ones, the engineering ones, the cube ones. I don't even know what that means. If you want web formulas, that's kind of interesting. Math and trigonometry. So this is like the master list. We should probably try to figure out a way to create one that's for architecture, and that can list all of those functions that we're going to use. Again, I will give you access to the spreadsheet so you can take a look at them here and try them out yourself. So that should work. Now, there's also the next one, we have minimum and maximum formulas. So if I want to find the smallest value in a particular range, in this case, what's the minimum number, the smallest number in this range? And it's going to tell me that it's 23. Now, the next formula is max. So what's the largest one? I just type max equals max, and then I specify my number range, and it's going to tell me that that is 300. So those are useful too to get the upper and lower. Now, I'll go over this one quickly. I actually have a blog post on ArchSmarter that does kind of a walkthrough of using VLOOKUP. VLOOKUP is good where you have data that you don't always want to repeat every single time. So in this case, I'm showing a door schedule, and I have my door number, my door type, and then I have my door size. Now, I also have another little table here that's showing my various door types. And I'm indicating them based on the type number, and then it has the size here. So the issue is, what happens if a door size changes? So say that this changes from 3 foot, by 7 foot, say it changes to 4 feet. Now, if I was doing this manually, I'd then have to go through my spreadsheet and edit these manually and make sure I didn't miss one. So yeah, Elron, that's very similar. You're right that the VLOOKUP is similar to kind of a key schedule in Revit. So I can drive data from one location based on a key into another location. It takes a little bit of time to set up. In this case, you'll see that in each cell I have this set up at VLOOKUP. And what I have to specify is the lookup value. So my lookup value in this spreadsheet is the door type. And then I have to specify the table array, which is my, my little door type schedule here. This could also be in a separate worksheet, for example. It doesn't have to be on the same worksheet. and then I specify the column number index. So I'm looking at the second column of my table, and then that's what it's going to input into as this value. So let's change this back to 3, and then all of these doors that have door type A change back to 3 by 7. So same thing goes here. I'm just going to add a bunch of garbage, and it's looking at that. So you'll see that it's pulling the data directly from another location. So I'm not duplicating things. I'm only entering it once here, and then I'm driving that value elsewhere. And again, if you're used to how it does things, you edit your family in Revit, and then it pushes all those changes out into your door schedule. Same concept here. Again, let's take a little bit of time to set up, but definitely worth it. And Andrew, you're asking if you add additional rows in the VLOOKUP. Let's check that out. It should adjust itself. So let's add a type AAA. So yeah, it looks like the VLOOKUP. Yep. So the VLOOKUP is adjusting itself as you enter additional cells, which is good to know. Okay. A couple other good ones that are good to use. There's a round function that you can use if you want to round off values, and it's simple. You just type equals round. You specify the value and then the number of decimal places. So in this example, I'm rounding it to 2 decimal places. If I set that value equal to 0, I'm adding it, no decimal places, and then I can specify 1, however many I want. So again, depending on the type of data you're working with, that's a good one. Just a couple more quick ones. So the next one is called floor and ceiling, and this is also similar to round, where if you're, you need to round up or you need to round down. So my original value is 123.77. As the formula, I'm using floor. So in floor it's rounding down. So it's rounding my value down by tens. So it's going to round that down to 120. I could set that to round it down by hundreds, by 100, and you'll see it rounded it down to 100 itself. Now ceiling is pretty much the same. Nope, so you can round down and you can round up. So you rounding down, you use floor. Rounding up, you use ceiling. And that's how it works. So in this case, I'm using ceiling, and I'm saying to round up by 0.25. So my original value is 155.55. And now I can round that up by a quarter, so it's going to round it up to 155.75. So again, you want to use floor or ceiling, depending on which way you want to round, up or down. Okay, and last but not least, concatenate. So if you have columns with different strings and you want to add them together, you can use concatenate. And so in this case, I want to add, in my first example, zoom in, I'm going to add column B with column A, put that together in one string. So I use concatenate. This is a little bit of a mouthful to type out, but I'm going to concatenate string B2, then I'm going to add a comma, and I add the comma in quotes, and then I add A2. And that adds those together into my cell in column C. I can also add text to that. So in this case, I have a value in A2, and then I just want to, in front of the actual value itself, which is 104, I just want it to say the value of A2 is, and then it's just going to add in that value specifically after that. And again, I can do a similar thing. I don't necessarily have to type concatenate. What I can do instead is I can type I type equals, I type the cell number, and then I use and then in quotes, whatever value I want to add. In this case, I'm just adding a space, another and then the other cell. So if you don't feel like typing out concatenate, you can do that just as well too. Okay. So we're getting tight on time. There's a couple things I want to show. So that covers formulas. Again, I'll give you access to this file so you can take a look at it. They're definitely worth playing with. There's a lot that you can do with formulas. So there's a lot there to explore. Let me jump into our other, and I want to talk about pivot tables real quick. And this is the programming spreadsheet we looked at originally. So here was our original data. We reformatted that into a table, which helps us out a lot. We added a slicer so we can filter things by that. Now, again, I mentioned this before, but pivot tables are kind of funny because I think of, again, the name pivot. I'm thinking about something that's moving around relative to something else. Now, essentially what pivot tables are they are an easy way to summarize data. They are summary tables. So I have my regular table here. I'm going to create a new, just a new worksheet. And then I'm going to go into Insert. And actually, let me switch back to my, here we go. And I'm in Insert, and I'm going to click on Pivot Table. And I select that, and I get this dialog box that says Create Pivot Table. You can all see this. And I'm specifying a table, so it's reading the table from Excel that I created, and then it's going to insert the pivot table into a new worksheet. Or I could have it put it onto an existing worksheet. Let's just do a new worksheet. It's a lot easier. And then I click OK. And so this is what it looks like right now. Now I can specify which fields I want to show in the pivot table. So in this case, I want to add name, and I want to add category, and let's do extended area. And I can start to organize things on the right-hand side. So you'll see what I did is, if you can see this over on the right, it's a little bit small, but in the rows field, so I have columns and rows, so I can display my data in columns or in rows, and depending on the type of data, you may want to use one versus the other. In this case, though, I want to group my data by category and then by name. And then I also want it to add up, so it's doing a summation on the Adriano, so in Spanish they're called dynamic tables. That makes perfect sense. I'm totally on board with that. Yeah, that's much better than pivot tables. Maybe we can lobby to call them dynamic tables. So I'm having it sum the value of extended area. So that's what it's giving me right here at the top. So really a pivot table is a way to summarize data. I could take off the name field, and now it's just giving me a summary of all of my my space categories. So here's my grand total of the area. Now, where this gets interesting is, you can do a lot with pivot tables. This is a very simple example, but once you create the pivot table, then you can start looking at creating pivot charts, and the pivot chart is linked directly to our pivot table. So I'm just going to create a pie chart, and I'm going to dump that on next to it, and you'll see now it's showing me this breakdown of the area graphically. So it's just reading the data from the pivot table, and it's visualizing that. If I were to add a slicer, let me go up to, go back to the Analyze. And again, anytime that I click, once I've created a pivot table or a pivot chart, once you select that object, you'll get this context ribbon that will pop up. So you can do a lot of formatting after the fact, but you have to select that object itself, then you get the context ribbon. So I'm going to insert a slicer, and we'll set that to the category. So now I can start looking at, if I want to get the sum of just a couple of the items. So here it's showing me the summation of area in the campus amenity space, support space, and shared areas. If I wanted to see, common and enclosed, it will do that. So again, it is more like that dynamic table that we talk about. So let me show you what you can do is, if you're adding, various pivot tables, pivot charts, you can make a dashboard. So this dashboard is set up essentially on this same data. On this data here. I just did some formatting to it. That's it. But it has a series of pivot tables, and then it has a couple of pivot charts. Rama, you think you love Excel? Yeah, Excel can do some cool stuff. It's like as you get into it, you can do some really interesting things, especially when you get into dashboards. So if you think about creating a project dashboard, this is where it can get really, really interesting. Again, because you're looking at data that you're, say, coming out of, Revit or wherever, but then you can start to visualize it. And there's a bunch of other visualization tools. Tableau is one that does some really cool stuff. Microsoft has a new one coming out that's all, through the internet where you can visualize data. So there's some really interesting things, but they're kind of coming from this place where you're dealing with the data itself. And there's kind of taking that visualization part that you can do in Excel and taking it that next step. So then you're saying, can you format the height of the head and subhead rows? Yeah, there's a lot that you can do inside of that. So you can do a lot of formatting. Let me see if I can just adjust that. Yeah. So all I did inside, I selected that particular cell in the pivot table. And if I wanted to format that text, I can do that. So you have a lot of control graphically about how that's going to look. So Anthony, you're asking if you can send these outputs into your Revit sheets. The only way you'd be able to do that would be to take, print this. So I can print this if I wanted to. It looks a little bit funny. You can see that slicer looks funny, or I could do a screenshot. So you would have to do it as an image. That would be the only way, I think. But that's a great question. I think it would be great if you could get this type of analysis into Revit itself. It's a good idea for an add-in there. But again, this is a real simple example of what a potential dashboard could look like. So there's a lot that you can do with this, and I'd like to do another class just on dashboards again, because there's some really interesting things to start looking at the data specifically inside of your model or wherever that's coming from. Also, what I did here is I just took my grid lines off so it looks and presents a little bit better. So that's a quick introduction to pivot tables, pivot charts, and dashboards. Let me just switch over. We're running a little bit over time. You guys mind if I keep going for a few minutes longer? Is that okay? Reshma, you're asking how to turn grid lines off. I just did this. It's actually easy. If you go to page layout, the page layout ribbon, and you'll see under sheet options towards the middle, there's this grid lines checkbox. So you can control that and you can turn that on and off. Okay, so I'll keep going. I've just got couple more things I want to go over, and I'll go over them pretty quickly. Let me jump to my spreadsheet here. So this presentation, spreadsheet that I set up, it's just pivot tables and a slicer. That's it. Okay, so a couple things, I'll touch on these real quick. Graphically, when you're working on your spreadsheet, just some good rules of thumb. Always choose a good font. Typically, when you're presenting data, you want to use something like a sans serif font. You don't necessarily, don't use Comic Sans. Try not to use Times New Roman. Use something without serifs, and limit the number of fonts that you're going to use. So I like to try to stick to just 2. So you can use one font specifically for the data, and then another font for the headers. There's this great book. Let me see. Can you see this? I don't know if you can see the title of this. Typography for Lawyers. Seriously, there's a book just about typography for lawyers. But it's great. I mean, it goes into serious detail about fonts and what makes a good font and why lawyers would worry about fonts, why they should care about that thing. I think we need a book called Typography for Architects. Again, we're very visual. Ooh, practical typography, yeah, that's another good one. So, I think about fonts. Fonts, there are default fonts, and for these, most of the time I'm using just a regular Windows font. But I think if you want to take your spreadsheet up a notch, obviously considering the typography is a good thing. Align your data. Letter B. Quick sip of water here. Celeste, thanks for the practical typography website. I'll definitely check that out. I wish I knew more about fonts than I do. I think they're really interesting, so that'll be a good resource. Align your data. This is real simple. If you have text data, align it to the left. If you have numbers, align them to the right. That way, in this case here, you can see all of these numbers are aligned to the right, so you can easily see and read them. Obviously, 1,200 is bigger than 120. If I align them to the left, it takes a lot more work to see one value relative to the next. And try to avoid, especially with numbers, avoid center alignment. Not a good idea. Okay, use white space too. So give your values, give your data some room to breathe. You never want to kind of have data just crammed up into the corner. Give it a little bit of white space. It's kind of like you're composing sheets. You know, you want some room for that stuff to breathe. When you're creating a table and you're adding header, you know, always use headers and differentiate them. So use bold fonts to differentiate your header, capitalize them. You want to make it different so it's clear that this is a header versus this is the actual data. Also, to choose your colors carefully and try to limit the number of colors that you use. You know, 2 or 3 at the max, and use them to illustrate differences. So here's a header. Here is a a text value. So then you're asking about conditional formatting. That is one thing that I didn't talk about. Let me see if we can get to that. We're going to get to that in the bottom, but we can make a gradient from red to yellow and green. Can you lock the yellow value? I'll get to that in a second. So one good resource for colors, if you're looking for good colors, a site that I actually like to use, if you go to color.adobe.com, they've renamed this. This used to be called Cooler. Let's see how this comes in. So this is a dynamic. I think it's loading up. You should be able to see it in a second. Here we go. So it's a dynamic color choosing tool, and it's great. So you can pick your color rule, and you can graphically, choose a range of colors. So it's really fun to play with. And then it also will give you the actual RGB and hex values down there. So you can, find a range of complementary colors or however color, whatever you want as your color rule, and then just transport those values into your spreadsheet. Sometimes I just don't, I think I know what I want for colors, but I want to see how they're going to play out. So I find this tool to be really helpful, especially if I'm tired and I don't feel like picking the colors out. So that's a good one to use. Another one is shade your rows. You see that when we go to the table, it will alternate shade our rows, which is really helpful in terms of reading data down a particularly long spreadsheet. So if you use table, it will do that automatically. You can do it manually by filling the rows themselves. You can use conditional formatting, which is a little bit trickier to do it in that sense, but there's a bunch of different ways you can do that. And also to, use grids where they make sense, particularly if you're going to use grids, use them not so much in columns, but use them horizontally to band data, or think about how you want that data to read. Particularly if you're going to use shading every alternate row, then you don't necessarily need a grid to define each of those rows. Maybe you add your grids to the columns. So, but think about how that plays out. Another thing too is to use cell styles. And this gets really interesting. Again, if you have a format that you're going to use consistently, then you can actually set up styles and then apply those styles to your cells. And that way, if you adjust or make changes, then you can just update everything across the board. So you'll see under Style, here's our Style gallery. I can create all of these various styles. Here, I can edit these styles. I can modify them. And if you have a particular graphic sensibility that you want to apply across all of the spreadsheets you're creating, define those as cell styles. That way you're good to go. It takes a little bit of time to set up, but again, once you've set it up, then it makes it easy. Can you hear? Oh, there's the audio. Okay, good. And lastly, conditional formatting. Conditional formatting is great because you can set that up to highlight the cell, fill the cell based on the particular values. So in this case, I can set that up. If you go into the Home ribbon, and let me just back up, and you select the conditional formatting, you can specify particular conditional formatting rules. So in this case, I want to see which cells are greater than a particular value. So format cells that are greater than, say, 1,000 square feet. And then I can choose, yellow fill, green fill, light red fill, and I click OK. And then anytime, any value that gets entered, it's going to apply those rules to that cell. So these are kind of the predefined. You can get very specific, like you could do color scales. So in this case, it's defining, a range of colors. It may not do the range that you want, so you can specify the rules here. So I could do a 3-color scale, and then I can specify that range if I want red, minimum, green maximum, and then my midpoint. And I have control over exactly where that midpoint's going to fall. And you can also do, a data bar. So again, there's a lot. We could do a whole class just on conditional formatting. I think that the takeaway is that you can use that in your spreadsheet, particularly if you're doing some troubleshooting or if you want to highlight conditions that may not be good. So for example, if you have, going back to our programming spreadsheet, instances where, your actual program versus your program area are, the difference is greater than 10 square feet, then you have a problem if your program area isn't being met. So you could use conditional formatting to highlight those areas. So very quickly, visually, you can see where you've got to focus on. Okay. Now, that's it. Oh, actually, I want to show you just a quick example. So here is, let's go back. Eugene, yes, I'm recording this webinar, so no problem if you missed it. I'm going to have it up. Hopefully, I'm going to take a look at it, make sure it looks good, and I'll have it up for download early next week. That's the plan. So this is a real quick example. Here's a nasty-looking programming spreadsheet. You can see, this is hard to read. I'm using grids, like there's no hierarchy. It's hard to tell. At least I have bold in my headers, but this isn't all that easy to look with. I'm not helping to look at, not helping the user actually understand the data. So using the rules that we just talked about, here it is reformatted. So, I'm using color sparingly, but I'm using it to highlight certain things like my headers and my subtotals. I've changed my font. I now have, though, also a hierarchy of fonts, so my headers are bolder. And it just will help people understand the data much better. I've aligned my text accordingly to the left and to the right. And so, again, it's a lot more legible. This is a lot more sympathetic to the reader in the sense that this is helping them understand the data. And I think that's the one point is that, use your formatting and graphics to make it easier to understand. Now, I just want to do one last quick thing since we're doing kind of all sorts of stuff you can do in Excel. I just want to talk about some other uses, maybe non-standard uses for Excel. And this gets a little bit into programming and macros, but I've had instances where I've needed to do some pretty tedious tasks, say like with file management, that sort of thing. And Excel is great in those occasions because you can actually program and write macros in Excel, and they can do things like file management, renaming files. I'll show you a quick example, and then I'll talk about how I did this briefly. I had a instance where I was getting a bunch of drawings ready to be issued. Let me see if I can switch this. My computer is getting tired. It's been a long day. Here we go. We zoom in. So this is a real simple spreadsheet. It has a bunch of different worksheets here. But essentially, I had a bunch of DWG files, for example, and I had a bunch of PDFs. So this was a drawing set that we were trying to issue. It was, I think, 200 or 300 drawings, and we needed to check all of our DWG files, all of our PDF files against our drawing index to make sure that we had every single file and we were issuing every file that we said what they were. In the past, the way I've done this is I'd print up my drawing index and then I'd manually go through the file folder and make sure I had every PDF and cross them out. People are changing files and adding files and moving files, and there's a lot of stuff going on. It's the last day before we're going to issue this CD set. So rather than have to do that manually a bunch of times, I said, well, why don't I just make a spreadsheet that could do that for me? So in this case, you can see I have my sheet count, and then I have it calculating, my missing PDFs, missing DWGs, extra PDFs, extra DWGs. So I have a whole series of worksheets here that go through, and here's my drawing index. Here's all the sheets I say I'm issuing. And then I'm also able to get all my PDFs, all my DWGs from the folder here. So using a little bit of programming, I was able to create this tool that would do all of that manually checking for me. Like, I didn't want to do that myself. I would rather have Excel do it for me. And this is a bit beyond the scope, of this session, especially since we're over time. But I'm going to go into the Developer tab in Excel, and you may have to add this in yourself. It doesn't always show up, and I can show you how to do that in a second. But this gives me access to the macro tools. And one thing that I really like about Excel is that you can record a macro. So I can turn on, I can say I'm going to record this macro, and then I can just start doing stuff. And let me add these to be bold, and and whatever I'm doing. I stop that. What Excel is going to do is it's going to translate those actions that I did into code in a macro using Visual Basic, VBA, Visual Basic for applications. And it's a really good way if you have to do a lot of repetitive stuff, particularly like formatting, select this cell or select this range of cells, turn them to bold. The Excel macro recorder will translate those operations into code that you can then edit and modify. So it's really powerful in that sense. This particular spreadsheet I wrote, there's a lot of macros in here. Actually, let's take a look at. Here's that macro that I just recorded. And you can see the code. Let me see if I can zoom in on it. No, I can't. But I selected a cell. I added some text. And I made a couple changes to it. So there's a lot that I can do with this, and I can record this, and I can start to understand actions that I'm doing on the screen, how that gets translated into code. So I'm going to leave it at that. Essentially, I think that would be maybe a good topic for a future webinar to look into how you can record macros and how you can use Excel to do some other stuff. But suffice to say, this spreadsheet was really a tool rather than writing a piece of software. I did it, in Excel, but it actually saved me a ton of time and was a lot more accurate because in the end I could get a quick picture of which sheets I was missing. There's a lot of code here that I wrote, but it didn't take me too much time, and it's totally doable. But again, we'll cover that in another session in the future. So let's wrap things up. I'm going to go back to, where are we? Here we go. Okay, let me clear this out. Thanks for sticking around. I really appreciate it. Let me go back, and we'll leave it at that for today. I'd love to get your feedback on this session. Comments, suggestions. Was the audio okay? Was the video? Like I said, this is the first time that I've actually done a webinar like this. I'd like to do them in the future. I'd like to do at least one a month, maybe one every couple of weeks. And then also if you have suggestions for topics, I think the next one, I want to do one on Dynamo. If you're interested, certainly let me know. If there's anything in particular that I covered today that you'd like to learn about more in depth, let me know about that as well. If you want to do something with dashboards or get into, recording macros, definitely let me know. And you can always email me at any time, michael@archsmarter.com. But thanks again. I really appreciate it. Sticking around 20 minutes extra. I appreciate your time very much and for coming out for this. And as I said to you, I've recorded this. I'm going to take a look and make sure it looks good and make sure the quality is good, and then I'll have it available for download as well as some of the sample files, and I'll send an email out so you'll get that. Okay, that's it. Thanks again. Have a great day. Get back to work, and I'll talk to you later.